All right, well, good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Elli Blaine, and I'm the new Urban Soil Health Program Director with the IASWCD, which is the Association of Soil and Water Districts here in Indiana. And I'm just really excited to join back up with you again today and talk more in depth about practices that you can implement on your own gardens, small farms, and etc. So without further ado, just kind of run through a few introductory slides here just on what we're going to try to accomplish today. I will revisit soil health. What is soil health? What is its definition? What are those main principles that we're aiming to achieve with the practices that we'll cover? Run through some small scale ag examples, and then really spend most of our time delving into those on-farm practices. What does cover cropping look like? What can mulching look like on your farms? And what are we able to achieve with those practices? And then hopefully wrap up with some of the common tools and equipment to achieve these practices. So last week, Stephanie took us through a lot of demos about what soil health can look like in our soils. What are those practices that we're doing on our farms achieving when it comes to the soil level? What are we seeing those differences be when we change our management practices to aim towards soil health versus practices that may not have soil health as their primary goal? And so the soil health definition, for those that aren't familiar or this is new, is just a reminder that it is the continued capacity of soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. And to me, this definition doesn't stop being inspiring because it helps to guide us towards an ecosystem approach or a system-wide approach to our soils, and remind me that there are so many, thousands of different components that are happening beneath our soils to make that system functional, right? Make our soils functional. And it is a living ecosystem. That word right there is so important because it centers soil life, which is at one of the most important components when it comes to soil health and enhancing productivity of our soils, and making sure that we can continue, as this says, or sustain our plants, animals, and humans. And I guess I'm kind of bouncing back again. It has the word function in there. I think soil health is really at its center, talking about soil function. And if we don't center soil health at the core of what we're trying to achieve, we can lose that function over time and get into practices that may not continue to support us for the long term. And so building upon this definition, we have been able to break out 4 soil health principles, and these principles have been promoted by the NRCS and other conservation agencies as a way to help get at the core of different buckets of practices and what they can fall into, and take that definition of soil health and break it into kind of these core pillars. And these core 4 soil health principles include minimizing disturbance, maximizing soil cover, maximizing biodiversity, and maximizing continuous living roots. And when we have all of these 4 principles centered, we are able to typically get towards that more functional soil health system. And so I'll revisit these in a little while, but I want to transition to Stephanie here to take us back to a demo, because I think these demonstrations really help visually show what can soils look like when soil health is centered as a core of the management practices, and then what do soil function what does soil function look like when those are not at the core of the practices. And so Stephanie, I'll cue to you here for our slump test demo, which is a new demo for those that were on last week.
All right, Ellie, thank you so much. And it's so awesome to be able to be here with you guys today and kind of talk about, again, more about soil health and delve into soil function and really thinking about what that means. And so today we're going to be looking at a slump demonstration. And I'm going to challenge you to go out and do this in your garden, because all you really need are some basic tools. Probably the most complicated tool that you're going to use, or piece of material that you're going to use here today, is a sink strainer like this. So that's what I use as a sink strainer. You see, I have some plates here for some dry soils, and then we're going to put the wet soils on this plate over there, and some Dixie cups with water. But you know, most of this you could use any different types of materials to do those things, but the strainer is going to be the most important part. So again, we're using the same soils that we used last week for a lot of these demonstrations. I wanted to keep them to be the same type of soils for this conversation. So the soil on our right, this is our healthy soil that we're looking at here. I want to remind you about those aggregates, right? So we have larger aggregates, and as we break that aggregate down, it becomes smaller and smaller pieces, but again, they maintain that shape, right? So those aggregates are holding together, and when we get a bunch of aggregates together, we have a large aggregate, and as we break a large aggregate down, we have smaller aggregates, or sometimes scientists will call those micro aggregates. So what you're going to do is you're going to go out to your garden and you're going to shovel off maybe the top 3 or 4 inches of soil. Just scrape along that surface of that soil and kind of break that soil into the smaller pieces, BB-sized pieces. So even pieces like this, if you can break them up, maybe a little bit smaller. So we're going to get those BB-sized pieces, and we're going to stick those pieces into the strainer. So I'm just going to kind of scoop some up right here. And if you notice on the bottom side of that strainer, there's smaller pieces there to look at as well. So I'm going to just stick them in that strainer here, and we're going to set it aside, and we'll go over to the next one. So that's our healthy soil on the right. On the left here, we have that soil that came from that heavily disturbed system. So again, if we kind of look at that, that kind of has that almost more powdery look, right? We have some aggregates in there, and as we take them and break them up, they might hold together. But what we tend to see happening more often is that as we break it up, they'll get smaller and smaller, but eventually they're going to just turn into individual pieces of sand, silt, and clay. Because again, we've broken down those soil glues that are coating those aggregates because we've stirred that soil up so much. So we're going to take the other strainer, and we're going to just scoop that into this strainer as well. And I'm sure you can see the dust kind of blowing here as I scoop this up, right? We think about, again, those clay particles and those silt particles being loose. They're not held together by those glues. And on this nice breezy day where I'm at outside, which you might be able to hear on the microphone, but again, those clay particles are going to just blow, thinking about wind erosion and things like that. So we're going to take these 2 strainers. Again, look at what the soil aggregates look like in there on this healthy soil. And we got this one over here, this unhealthy soil. And we're going to put them in the water. And when I put them in the water, I like to put them in the water so that they're totally covered. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick them up so you can kind of take a look at them right now. So you can kind of see, right? I got them in the water, soil's under the water, and it's sitting in this cup here. Take a look at the other one. You can even see a little bit. We can see quite a bit of difference. Soil here is highly disturbed soil. We can see that container of water is pretty cloudy. But again, we got the soil in the strainer. It's all covered with water. So what this slump assessment is looking at is it's looking at the ability of those water stable aggregates to maintain themselves. So we want to break them up into those super small pieces, We want the water to flow around them in these strainers, right? Have that water come in and around all of those aggregates that I broke up. And then we're going to take them out of the water and we're going to put them on these plates right here. So I like to let them set for about a minute or so. And after about a minute, we're going to pick these strainers up and we're going to drain out that water. You can even see a difference in those cups, can't you? What's coming out of them and what's sitting in that cup of water. And after that free water kind of drains out of there, I'm going to take these strainers and I'm going to dump them right on the plates. So this is our slump. So let's take a look at these slumps. I'll pick the healthy soil up first. So remember we were talking about those aggregates, right? We got those BB size aggregates and we can actually still see those aggregates, right? Even as I kind of open this slump up a little bit, we can still see those aggregates. They've maintained their shape. So again, this is a soil where those aggregates, they had those glues, those biological glues around all those aggregates. And when we put them in the water, that aggregate held its shape. We have a little bit of water coming out, but we notice it's not a ton of water and it's actually still pretty clean. The more organic matter you have in your soil, again, the more that water is going to be held in the slump. So our unhealthy soil here, let's kind of tip this one over and kind of look at the water that's running out of that. Okay, so even as I tip this plate just a little bit, that slump can't even stay in place. It just slides across that plate, right? And we saw the water coming out of it, and then the slump is sliding around. But then let's take a look at that soil itself. We had some aggregates in there, but when we kind of open the soil up now, there's really nothing left in there. It's all melted. It's those particles of sand, silt, and clay, they've all broken up. Any aggregate that was in there, it melted, and we've turned into pretty much just almost a mud pie, something that, you know, a kid would like to play with on a nice hot day, right? And so thinking about having our healthy functioning soils, this assessment that we're doing here today can help you evaluate whether or not you have soil function. And so again, looking at these aggregates and what they look like, and again, as I open them up, we can kind of see that they're maintaining their shape, they're holding together. And what's really cool about this is, you know, Ellie and Bree and Heather and I, we've done quite a few of these demonstrations and these meetings. And I'm going to tell you this, and you're going to think I'm crazy, but these two plates right here, these are the plates from the last time I did this, right? And so these are the same soils here. The ones on the back are the soils that I just wet, and the ones in the front are the ones that have been dried for about 3 weeks. And what you'll see, again, is this healthy soil. Look at how those aggregates are still continued to be maintained. They've been sitting on this plate for a little while, so they're maybe a little bit weaker than what they were before, right? They don't have anything covering them or growing on them, but they still are aggregates. They're ready to go. They're ready to infiltrate more water. Look at this soil right here. What does that look like? We have a dried out, crusted surface, right? And we got cracks in there. And this soil, if I take this and start to push on it, that soil is going to just fall apart back into that powder. And so when we have an unhealthy soil, the biggest function that we lose when we don't have water stable aggregates is that ability of that water to infiltrate and then allow that water to continue to soak into the soil and then have that air go back in, because our soil surface seals up and then we can't get any more water in and we have runoff. And when it's dry, that soil is crusted. And when that soil is crusted, we can't get oxygen back in that soil. And our plant roots are aerobic, our microbes are aerobic, just like we are. And we need to continue to have the ability of that soil to exchange air and water. And when we lost that function, when we can't infiltrate water anymore and we don't have those water stable aggregates, we lose the rest of the functions in our soil pretty quickly. So, this is just a really brief demonstration, but what I like about this is I think it's more than a demo because it's actually an assessment. This is something that you can go and do out in your garden or your field today, right now. The only time that I would recommend not doing it is if it's completely waterlogged. When you're trying to break it into the BBs, that you roll it into clay balls, then it's too wet to do this. But other than that, you could do this just about any time of the year and go and do this assessment. And what's really interesting to point out is that you can have a spot like this right next to a spot like this in your field, right? If you have a bare soil surface or we don't have any plants covering it, or if it's, just those spots like that, we can get this kind of area in any spot in any field across the entire state or entire country. So the focus today is to think about those conservation practices that we can use to maximize this type of soil at our surface in every circumstance, or as in many circumstances as possible, throughout much of the year as possible. So as Ellie's going through these practices, she's going to talk a lot about those practices and how they can improve infiltration and keep our soil surface protected. And those are key factors to build soil function and build water stable aggregates. So that's all I have for a demo. We want to keep it brief and straightforward and get back to Ellie's presentation on the practices. But again, like I said, I challenge you guys to go out and do this today or tomorrow, and then send us an email or send Heather an email. Show us the pictures of what you guys saw when you did this out in your gardens or in your fields. I would love to see that.
Hey, Stephanie, we do have a question for you.
Okay.
This question was, does moisture as a soil health factor have parameters that are more conducive to better soil health if maintained? So I think we're asking, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dan, do we focus on keeping that soil moisture at a certain level?
Well, I would say the answer to that would definitely be consistency, right? So the more that we can keep our soil consistently moist, the better off we're going to be. So if we think about that, the importance of that soil cover, and how if our soil is covered and protected, we're going to have less evaporation. Our soil is not going to dry out as quickly. And so that's a really important thing to keep in mind as we look at building function. The other thing with that is if we think about during the growing season when our soils do dry out, right? If we have low moisture or less moisture, that not only impacts our crop growth, but that impacts our microbes and those other things that live in the soil that are responsible for building those water stable aggregates and helping to cycle our nutrients. And so soil moisture is a really key factor. If we go from east to west across the country, you head out further west, nutrient cycling is slower. Residue breakdown is slower because they are moisture limited and all of those things. And so, yeah, soil moisture is a key factor. And so it's all about trying to keep it there if we can by protecting that soil surface and minimizing evaporation.
Thank you. And any other questions? I don't think I see any. Well, thank you, Stephanie. We know you need to dash, but we appreciate you demonstrating this today.
Yeah, and I really appreciate being a part of this. And I know there's a planter in the background making some noise, so I am going to mute myself, and I might stick around for a little bit longer, but I will have to take off in a little bit. And thank you so much for this opportunity, everyone. And I'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for being flexible, setting this up out in the field. Just helps show us and encourage us all to be flexible and make it happen and reach you where you're at, and us join where we're at too. So I'll transition here back to some slides. Just one second. So I have this long list of soil health benefits on here, right? And it's a lot of words, it's a lot of text, but I think for the most part, it comes back to what Stephanie just shared, which is what you saw visually, that when we center soil health with our farming practices and management practices, we can help to increase soil organic matter, increase the water holding capacity. What you just saw, that ability for soil to function, hold moisture, release it over time. increase our soil aggregate stability. Those aggregates that Stephanie showed us help with water infiltration. So that water can percolate through those soil aggregates and then be held, deeper in our soil profile for longer, and then also help to manage and maximize nutrient use in our soils, help promote and stimulate different soil biology and microbes. So there's all of these benefits that I think on a list can sometimes be overwhelming. What does that actually mean in practice? And what I love about the demonstrations or assessments that you can do on your own land is that you really see what that looks like and what that can look like and what those differences are in practice. So I want to, before we really get into the nuts and bolts of practices, just give a broad umbrella view of what our urban and small farm community looks like, because as I could see from the chat, a lot of you are farming at small scales. You may have a large farm as well. You may be farming primarily on a large farm, but there's a lot of you that are doing diverse vegetable production, cut flowers, perennials. So it's great to be reaching you in the growing that you're doing. And I guess one of the reasons we wanted to do these sessions is just to remind us all that soil health is for everyone. And no matter what scale you're farming at, there are practices out there that can be implemented to center soil health and work towards more soil function. So some of the small scale ag that I work with, that we're seeing and trying to reach, are our market farms, community gardens, church farms, schools, demonstration farms, and your backyard gardens. And a lot of those production activities are on a very small footprint and very diverse, often organic vegetable production as well. Could have mixed perennial vegetables in there, and cut flowers. So you've already answered what you grow in the chat. So I'll move on and just show some quick photos of a few different activities, a few different scales, just to as a reminder for all of us that no matter where you're at, what you're doing, soil health can be a focus. So here's an example of a 1 acre intensive market farm downtown Indianapolis, where they are growing vegetables for market. And then we also work with acre farms that are in a more rural environment. This farm is, surrounded by more corn and bean and soy farming activities, and they are, an important part of what our farming landscape looks like across the state. We also work with, small farms that are still on the larger side of that small farms, right? This one is around 40 acres. She has 2 high tunnels, is doing beekeeping, mushroom production, livestock production as well. So there's really this diversity and spread of farms across our state, which I've seen with some of you that are here too. And community gardens. Some of you are involved in community gardens, and I think this is going to continue to just spread, where you may have a few raised beds producing food for the community, either for individual families or to be distributed, through a church or other nonprofit. We work with school gardens where, there may be a farm manager there helping to grow food on the off season when school isn't in session, helping to engage students in classroom activities. And, this particular grower is implementing, we've worked with to help implement soil health practices, mulching, cover cropping, more, diverse production activities, and nonprofit gardens. I think a lot of our land, especially in more urban environments, can be used, and we're seeing it being used to grow food. And this particular farm donates all of the vegetables that they grow. And then, of course, we have our backyard gardens. This is an example of my backyard garden from last year. And, you know, it's quite small, but I pack as much as I can in there and mulch when I can, cover crop when I can. And, you know, it's still more than I can eat for myself. And you may also, you know, as some of you demonstrated, have your backyard garden right next to your large acreage field as well of row crops. And these are all scales that we can work with to center soil health. In the cities, we're seeing vacant lots being turned into gardens, and have a couple of our universities that are working with interns, working with apprentices on diverse production to either feed into their school cafeterias or to sell at market as well. Some of you, especially those that work with SWCDs, may be familiar with demonstration gardens at fairgrounds or with master gardeners or at your own offices. And this is a perfect place, I think, for us to demonstrate soil health practices and trial different cover crop mixes, trial different production methods that work on soil health as well, and a great way to engage community members. Here's another example of that from a plot where people can rent on an annual basis. And Kevin Allison with the Marion County SWCD has rented 3 different plots and has a situation with the city where they won't be tilled, whereas the rest of the field is tilled, but he can turn this into a showcase or an example of a soil health garden, and then bring volunteers out and really see what those practices are in practice. We have a lot of church or faith-based gardens as well, primarily growing food to donate through pantries. So all of these examples kind of build together, right, and form the landscape of agriculture around our state. And what we've seen is a lot of the, you know, soil health work has primarily been in on a large farm arena, which makes sense in many ways, right? We're touching more acres, we're able to conserve more resources when we have that large scale impact. And at the same time, there's this patchwork of smaller farms, urban farms, that all have their different reasons for growing food and are primarily growing food typically. So I just want to acknowledge that, you know, that my work and the work of others across the state, conservation agencies, and you all come together to help improve soil no matter where we are. So if you want to pop in the chat why you are growing food, it would be great to know your reason behind why you're interested in what you are doing. So coming back to those soil health principles, again, they're minimizing disturbance, maximizing soil cover, maximizing biodiversity, maximizing continuous living roots. These all work in tandem, and many of the practices I'm going to touch on can touch on many of these principles, right? If we're doing, let's say, cover cropping, that can help maximize soil cover because we're planting a plant when the soil may otherwise be bare. And we can also terminate that cover crop in a way that we use that mulch throughout the season to help continue that cover throughout the growing season. Maximizing biodiversity. Similarly, we could do that either based on the crops that we're growing or through the diverse cover crop mixes that we plant. So all of these practices can really work as a system and achieve those soils that Stephanie helped to show. We typically break out these practices into what we refer to often as soil health management systems. You may have heard conservation cropping systems, and primarily I like to hit on crop rotation, cover cropping, no-till or reduced tillage, as well as mulching, nutrient management, and then pest management. And primarily for this, I'll talk about cover cropping and mulching and try to hit on a few of the others too. So no-till or low-till, I think of this practice, yes, it's one of the practices listed as others are, but I think of this as pretty foundational and more of a goal. Yes, it is a practice, but it's what we're aiming towards on our land, to reduce the amount that we're disturbing that soil, tilling the soil, as a way to help all of these other practices work in tandem. And so some of the soils that we see when we are able to reduce the amount that we're disturbing them are ones similar to this photo that have those living roots that are helping to hold together soil, hold together those soil particles that have life in them, that are exuding glues and helping to hold those soils together. And I won't spend much time on this, but what you saw in Stephanie's assessment is what can happen when we overly disturb soil. And this is from a farm that was transitioning to permanent beds. So you can see on here, these hills will become permanent beds, and the soil was tilled heavily prior to making those beds. And you can imagine that in these dips, those will be the walkways. They're pretty wet right now, but when it dries out, this little call out box is what we can see happen when those soils dry out. They lose that function to really infiltrate the water that is entering the system and start to crack and have much harder of an ability to support plants over time, support productivity over time. So I guess this is the alternate of what we're trying to achieve. And I know there are many different ways of getting towards soil health, right? There's always a spectrum of what we do. And so no-till or low-till, that's more of a principle that we're aiming to achieve where we can, when we can. On the flip side, a garden that may be doing less disturbance could look like this, where all of those permanent beds here are mulched and the crops planted directly into these beds. So instead of tilling this entire field, this farmer has these permanent beds and does minimal disturbance on each bed prior to planting. There may have been some light disturbance to manage weeds prior to planting, and then the farmer mulched and then planted crops directly into that mulch. This is another example of that, where by these permanent beds stay in place and soils are able to build over time in those permanent beds. The walkways here have been cover cropped with a crimson clover cover crop, and then zucchini is planted directly into the mulch. These are pretty young plants, so you can't see them big. And these red arrows just signify that those are the permanent beds where growing will happen year after year after year. Another example of how to, I guess, move towards minimal disturbance or less disturbance that we see a lot of growers doing is using silage tarps as a form of weed control. That can be one of the primary challenges when moving towards a lower disturbance system, is to how to manage weeds. And tarping can be a pretty effective method to kill weeds and then be able to not have to till an entire field to manage those weeds. Often tillage can also bring up a lot of the seed bank of weeds that we have existing in our soils, and can actually over time enhance weed issues if you're not using, and especially I guess if you're not using chemical controls to control your weeds. On conservation, crop rotation, I won't spend too much time on crop rotation here, but you're probably familiar if you work with diverse vegetables that you could be planting 30 to 40 different crops. And this is an example of one grower's schedule of starting seedlings, then planting those seedlings out or transplanting into the farm, and what the harvest schedule looks like. So not to emphasize you need to ingest all of this information, but just as a way to acknowledge that there are so many different crops that a diverse vegetable farmer is going to be planting, that you're naturally going to have crop rotation over time and diversity in your systems, and that diversity can really be beneficial in the kinds of soil microbes that you're supporting and minimizing disease pressure and weed pressure too. It is important to still be aware of what plant families you're planting and what crops you're rotating in order to help, maximize that reduced pest pressure, reduced disease pressure. And we'll share out some resources later on for you to follow up. This manual here from Sayer on crop rotation on organic farms is really useful, not only for organic farms, but all farms, on what to be aware of when rotating crops. And you can see from this example, a small farm in a very small space could have 5 different crops growing and be rotating them even throughout the season as well. So cover crops, this is where I'll spend the most time. They are typically an unharvested crop, so you're not really getting a productive, you're not harvesting a fruit or a vegetable or a grain from the cover crops. They are part of your rotation and are planted in order to help increase soil health, provide conservation benefits to the soil. And typically most of the cover crops here in Indiana are planted in the fall, but there are also some summer and spring cover crops that can be added in the mix. And I love cover crops. They can be used in so many versatile situations, different mixes. There's a lot of opportunities for us, even at a small scale, to be using cover crops strategically and to help our productivity as well as our soils when using cover crops. So an example you may be familiar with from a large farm is what I show here, which is cereal rye that has been planted in the fall, and it has these nice rows because it's been planted in the field with a drill, and it was drilled into a no-till field. So this farmer, getting back to that minimizing disturbance, this farmer did not till prior to planting, and post-harvest drilled the cereal rye directly into the field. And then, and then this growth is what you see in the spring, in early spring, with that cover crop. This, you may be familiar on a larger scale. This is what that next stage looks like for this farmer, where corn was planted into that residue, that cereal rye that was chemically terminated. And you can see the little corn plant coming up. So that is a way, without either fall tillage or spring tillage, that farmers can grow in a system that is prioritizing planting cover crops as well, maximizing those living roots underground and helping to preserve those aggregates and build those aggregates over time in our soils. There are also farmers that are planting green prior to terminating chemically. And this can help enhance the soil life that is, and that activity prior to planting, and kind of maximize maximize that system, that nutrient cycling in our soils right before that critical time of planting. We won't see this on a, on a small scale as much, but we can implement ways of using cover crops when they are still living, and terminating them in a way that maximizes some of their benefits. Here's an example of cereal rye being planted on raised beds. And so no matter what scale you're on, you can use these to effectively build your soils. From Kevin Allison's demo plot in Marion County, you can see what spring growth may look like in the field, where the rest of these plots will be divided up for the community and rented out. They do till the rest of the fields, but what I love about this photo is it just shows how lush and green cover crops can be. I think I was wrong that this is actually taken from the fall, post right before the winter. So you have probably oats cover crops and peas, ones that will die over the winter, but you can preserve that that life and increase the soil life activity by planting cover crops and minimizing disturbance from fall tillage. This example was from a farm that on one side of the field did not plant cover crops, and on the other side of the field did plant cover crops. So you can see in a relatively short amount of time, at least what I see in this photo, is that although there wasn't a whole lot of time for this cover crop to grow, there was still the ability to use those root systems of the cover crop to help stabilize the soils and help take up water, infiltrate water, cycle water. So this was a winter kill cover crop. Both of these photos taken in the spring. So I guess somewhat backing up or helping to frame cover crops a little bit better, we have winter kill versus winter survival cover crops. And on this farm, you can see both being used. And so on the left, we have a winter survival cover crop, likely cereal rye. And on the right, most likely it was a oats cover crop that died and then was mulched up with some additional straw, it looks like. So this photo would be taken in the early spring when the cover crop on the right had already experienced some freeze temperatures from our winters. And on the left, that cereal rye that started to grow in the winter is just starting to, just starting its spring growth. You can see this on a small scale too, where we use cover crops on two sides of a raised bed. So this may only be an 8-foot bed divided in two, and oats being used on one side, cereal rye and hairy vetch mix on the other. So we have our winter kill in a bed that most likely will be transplanting or seeding early spring crops, ones that we need to be able to get into that soil a little bit earlier for our production. And then on the right, winter survival crop that will continue to grow into later spring, early May, mid-May, and would be used for our later transplants or later vegetables in that situation. So I like that on a small scale, we can be very targeted with where we're using specific cover crops in a very small scale. Not that that can't happen on a large scale for sure, but We're usually doing a lot more diverse vegetables, and so have different goals for when we use specific cover crops. So how do we actually get these cover crops established? In many situations on a small scale, you can broadcast them by hand or use a small seeder. But if broadcasting by hand, you would just have the right mix or have the right rate in hand and spread that on the soil surface and then lightly fluff in with a rake, fluff that into the soil. I like to do this right before a rain so that we're maximizing the ability for that cover crop to take off really fast. So you can do this with a seeder too if you want a little bit more precision on where you're planting your cover crop. If you are doing rows of cover crops and then intend to plant in between those rows, for example, and you could use a seeder like the earthway seeder on the left. And you can also, if you want that entire bed, of course, to be all rather than rows, be planted with a uniform coverage, then plant on that larger scale and rake in, similar to what you saw before. So what do the cover crops look like in the fall? Most likely you are planting in the fall with a either a winter survival or a winter kill mix. You'll see growth in the fall. On the right is oats being planted. These will, depending on when they're planted, likely get 12 to 18 inches high before going into the winter. And on the left, you see a cereal rye and radish mix. You can kind of tell at the small stage of growth, the cereal rye is a little bit pinker or reddish in tone, and you'll get some growth in the fall and then most of the growth in the spring. The radishes in this mix will actually winter kill. So there's a pairing of a winter kill and winter survival species in this example. And I'll delve into a few of the species I've been talking about here, as well as some mixes that you can try out. So my typical go-to for species are oats, cereal rye, hairy vetch, and crimson clover. You see all of these being used on large fields as well, but typically in greater mixes. And you may most likely be using these as individual species or maybe maximum 3 or 4 species in a mix on a small scale, whereas you could have 15 or 20 different species on a large scale. Some of that depends on how you're managing them in the spring. A lot depends, I should say, on how you're managing them in the spring. If you are organically terminating them or if you're chemically terminating them. Typically, chemical termination allows a lot more options in terms of being able to have more species in your mix, whereas if you're organically terminating them, they all have different flowering periods, flowering stages. So depending on your goals and how you're managing them, you may want to still try to maximize your biodiversity, but minimize the complexity of what's in your mix. So oats are what I would say, if you take only one thing away from today, I would recommend that you try adding oats into your vegetable production strategy and rotation for the fall. They are kind of the easiest to play with in that they are a winter kill species. You can plant them between early August and maybe late September, and you can plant them in with your vegetables too. Like seed them if you still have a vegetable growing, or post harvest, plant them then, and they're really good for fall weed suppression, as well as mostly maximizing those living roots and providing microbes beneath the soil something to eat and feed on going into the winter. and helping to stabilize those soils via the glues and other activity in your soils that living roots help support. They also help add or support mycorrhizal fungi, and that will having mycorrhizal fungi in your soils will help with your next season production and nutrient cycling in your soils. Hairy vetch is also one that I really like to use on a small scale because we have a little bit more ability to manage and control its use. There is some concern on a large field that, let's say if you're aerially seeding with an airplane on a large scale, that you may have some spillover beyond your field, and that if it does continue to reseed, that it can become a problem. So I do want to recommend that you manage it well, know where you're planting it, in the spring, terminate it in a way without letting it go to seed. But it is a legume, and so helps to fix nitrogen in our soils. It is also really fast growing in the spring and produces a ton of above ground biomass. So it is a species that for about a 1 by 1 foot, like a foot square of space, can produce about a pound of biomass of living green mulch. And so that can be used in the spring to help with mulching. Crimson clover is another usually fall planted and then winter survival species that is a legume, helping to fix nitrogen in our soils, and so if allowed to flower in usually mid-May, can help support our pollinators as well. This is just a visual example of what I mean when I'm talking about nitrogen fixation. The hairy vetch and crimson clover roots have a symbiotic relationship with bacteria in the soil, where that bacteria is able to form a relationship with the roots and then fix nitrogen from our atmosphere that would be otherwise unavailable for our crops. And then we have cereal rye, which is a species that is also winter survival and gives us a little bit more of a window in the fall. You can typically plant it up until early November, sometimes mid-November. And so depending on your harvesting, gives you more of a window to get it in and get it planted, and also produces a lot of spring biomass if it's allowed to go to full stage, but can have many beneficial effects too if you tarp it or terminate it early as well. Puts down really deep roots, which help to break up compaction, and that biomass on top can be used kind of like a straw mulch over the course of the growing season. So a couple of mixes that I've liked to use are oats and a legume. So this is an example of oats and crimson clover, where the oats will die but be growing in the fall, so have that good weed suppression and root systems that help support life in the fall. And then the crimson clover kind of takes over in the spring, helping to fix nitrogen and give you a little bit more growth in the spring. Hairy vetch is the same way. Just depending on what you're planting, you could plant oats and hairy vetch instead. The oats really kind of act as a nursery crop too, I believe, for the other the legume that's planted. You won't see a whole lot of growth in hairy vetch in the fall, and so it's good, I guess, if you're planting a vetch, to usually add some oats in there too. So here's an example of what you could do on individual beds if you want a single species on the top of your bed, but then want to achieve more diversity, let's say in your walkways. So on the left, you see cereal rye being planted on the tops of growing beds, and then crimson clover planted in the walkways. So the cereal rye will be cut down and then planted into, and in this case, I would actually let the crimson clover go to seed, because I do like it to come back if possible in those walkways. But it really depends on the management of how you want to manage those walkways. Oats, field peas, and daikon radish is a really good mix to plant that are all winter kill species. So if you want to get into your bed early spring, you can plant a mix. So you still get diversity and yet have them all kill over the winter. So you can plant really early, either rake that residue off or leave it in place and transplant directly into it. And here's an example just to show that we can be very strategic row by row in what cover crop we want to plant right next to growing crops. So this farmer has oats, field peas, and daikon in one row, and then sun hemp and sorghum Sudan grass in the next row, which are both summer species and also winter kill. So really depends on what you're growing next, what you want to choose to plant as a cover crop, and just add it into those rotations of your vegetables. So how do we manage cover crops in the spring? How do we terminate them? You may see on a large scale biological termination, like in this example, where the hairy vetch field was either roller crimped or flail mowed, I'm not sure. Or you could see what I shared before, which is chemically terminating those cover crops and then planting into the residue. On a small scale, if you're organically terminating your cover crops or physically wanting to terminate them rather than chemically terminating them, you can use a lot of different tools to cut them down. This is an example of hairy vetch where it was scythed down. You can use a weed whacker, shears, and you'll want to cut down right at the base of that cover crop, so right where the roots meet the soil. And then depending on what you're doing with that bed, you can either take off that mulch, add it back, or manage it, on that bed individually. Sorry, I didn't say that very well. So cereal rye and crimson clover, those were the beds that I showed you before where there's cereal rye on top. You can cut down the cereal rye and leave it in place on those beds and transplant directly into it. On a raised bed example, the vetch and cereal rye was chopped down and left in place for transplants there. On a little bit larger scale, this shows an entire row of vetch and cereal rye cut down, and because this is being done biologically rather than chemically, the farmer cut it when it looks like in this year, the cereal rye was starting to go to flower at around the same time that the hairy vetch was going to flower, which doesn't always happen. And when those crops are putting their energy into seed production, you can pretty effectively kill them by cutting them. However, the cereal rye has a tendency to sometimes want to come back, especially if it's not fully at that flowering period. So the farmer took that next strategy of tarping the cover crop after cutting it down. So that will help prevent any regrowth and I guess start the decomposition process a little bit, but also still preserve that residue that then he'll plant likely watermelons, cantaloupe, winter squash, summer squash right into that residue. If you're on a scale where you have a walk behind tractor or tiller, there's a machine called a BCS, which has a different attachment possibilities. And there's one called a flail mower, which you may be familiar on those on a large scale. Some farmers using flail mowers to cut down on hundreds, thousands of acres. And this is for a small scale example where it chops up the residue, which you can see on the right. You can also crimp cereal rye depending on the stage of development. This is from a larger field where the rye was crimped and then soybeans drilled into that cover crop. The crimper on the left has wings that fold out, and instead of making a direct cut at the root base, you're actually just folding over those stalks so that the plant does not have an ability to continue to draw sugars and continue to grow. Don't recommend this and not to try at home necessarily doing it by hand. There are attachments for walk behind tractors where we just did not have one in this situation. So that's actually me trying to pull a specially fabricated roller crimper across cereal rye, and then summer squash is going to be planted right into this cover crop. Here's an example from a different farm where that was done not with a mechanical crimper, but actually by hand crimping the cereal rye and then zucchini planted into it. For hairy vetch cover crop, there's a lot of options too, and I'll try to go into a few more of the options for planting your vegetables right into residue. With this example with hairy vetch, on the right, you can see all of these raised beds were covered in hairy vetch, planted in the fall. This is its growth in the spring. And so the farmer went through and actually cut off all of that hairy vetch, took it off the bed, and then put it back in these nice little rows so that she could make furrows and seed right in between those mulch hills. So the hairy vetch will die pretty quickly and then remain on the soil surface, help provide cover, and be a dried out mulch in the future. For an oats cover crop, there's not much residue usually left on the top of the bed in the spring. Some of it decomposes over the winter, and for that which is left, it's very malleable. Soil is usually very soft, buttery, able to be worked with, so you can rake off that residue. This farmer just made a furrow right into the residue and then direct seeded lettuce right into it. And that can be done via transplanting as well, where you have the oat residue and then holes that were made right into it. So it's not a whole lot of top growth. You may have some issues with weeds here for sure, but can come back through and mulch, add some additional mulch in the future if you want. With hairy vetch, this was from a few years ago on from one of my raised beds where I grew the vetch, and instead of letting it fully die before planting tomatoes, I planted my tomatoes and then just made these rings of the residue around it to help retain moisture, keep the soil covered going through the season, and also provide a little bit of nitrogen from the roots of that growing cover crop, and then the breakdown of it too over time. You can see the abilities for transplanting into cover crop residue with either cereal rye going to tomatoes or hairy vetch going to peppers in this example. And on a bed, this was a master gardener's demonstration bed, shows just the ability of using cover crops to integrate into a small scale. This cereal rye and hairy vetch was cut down, and then planted into it was Swiss chard, arugula, beans, and that residue on the soil surface will help keep that soil protected throughout the season. Sorghum Sudan grass is a summer cover crop that is really great for breaking up compaction in our soils and giving us an ability between crops, let's say between early spring and late fall crops, to integrate a cover crop. And this grower actually used sorghum as a small strip in his growing bed in order to shade cilantro so that it would bolt less quickly. And I'll share out these resources later as links. There are a bunch of publications on how to manage cover crops and the characteristics of different cover crops. SARE had published those previous resources, and RCS has a great seeding calculator and seeding windows table, so you can see when you'd want to plant those cover crops, what the abilities are for different parts of our state. So I know we're kind of wrapping up on time here, and I always do this where I run out of time, or I want to talk more than I should, but I'll go through a few mulching examples as a way to wrap up. You can use mulch in either high tunnels or on individual beds, really to help suppress weeds, maximize soil cover, decrease evaporation. And this is an example of, lettuce being transplanted into mulch. The bed was mulched prior, and then the vegetables transplanted directly into them. And I think this is a really stark example of what Stephanie brought up about evaporation. On the left, these are both taken side by side, different beds. We have about 80 degrees or 76 degrees on one side, the soil temperature, and then around 63 degrees on a mulched bed underneath a transplant leaf. So you can just imagine how much water, when you're irrigating your fields, how much water you may lose if that soil isn't protected, and how much you may gain from either rain events or from your irrigation when that soil is protected. And how do you mulch? How do we integrate mulch? You can use either straw or hay, and both have their benefits. I've used paper to have a little bit of extra weed suppression. This is a newsprint roll, but you can also use newspaper and then build your mulch up. So adding that layer really helps with any small weed seeds that want to emerge, and gives you a little bit longer in the season before weeding. And then you'll add usually between 2 to 4 inches of hay on top of that, if possible, and then transplant directly into both of those layers. So managing nutrients, there are a lot of things we could touch on. I'm not going to focus on it too much, but I do recommend that if you're not sure where you're at with your soils, to start with a soil test. And on a small garden bed, you can break that up in many different ways depending on your goals. If you want to know, an average of the entire bed, you can take samples from individual beds, mix them together, and get an aggregate sample. Or you can, if you want to know what's happening in each bed and monitor that over time, take individual samples and get results for individual beds. And on a soil test report, the main things that I'm looking at are organic matter, typically, what your soil pH is, and then what the CEC is, which is your cation exchange capacity. So there's a bunch of other parameters that a soil test is going to give you on how to help balance your nutrient levels, but a lot is going to be affected by your organic matter, by your pH. And so this really helps give a baseline of where you're at and where you can go. pH is really important to be balanced, usually between 6.5 and 7, because that will give your plants the most ability to access nutrients that are already in the soils. So if you have a really acidic or really basic soil, there may be nutrients in the soil, but they're not available to plants. So the more you can balance pH, the more ability of those soils to regulate nutrients and provide those to the soil, to the plants, you'll be able to have. Oh, somehow I lost my screen. 1 second. Oh dear. All right, can you all see that again?
Yeah, we can see it just fine.
Okay, sorry. I went to a different desktop, I guess, for me. So just to wrap up this section, soil biology is key to soil nutrient management. And if we are able to center soil health practices, we will be able to help manage our nutrients even better. So yeah, I think there's a lot more emerging science on soil biology and its role in nutrient regulation and nutrient function. But this image I really enjoy because it helps to center both these soil health practices, which you can see in these bubbles here, as well as emphasizing that the soil nutrients that are the nutrients that are in our soils are those that are accessible to our plants. And the more we are able to build up the nutrient density of our plants that we're and our vegetables that we're growing, the more we'll be able to utilize those for our own health and well-being. So there's a strong connection between soil health, soil biology, plant health, and our own health as well. Won't spend too much time on this either, but our pest management, I'm sure is huge for you and a challenge every year. By there are many ways that you may use to manage pests. There are certified sprays, organic certified sprays, if you're in an organic operation, to help manage pests that are bacteria or plant-based. You may be using other chemicals to manage pests, but I just wanted to emphasize that as much as possible, I think we can, as farmers, be really proactive in our scouting, and that early stage of pest development is one of the best times for us to get out there and reduce the amount of pest pressure that we have. These are for squash bugs, and the best way that I've found to manage them is being proactive and catching them at this stage, being able to squash them before they scatter everywhere and are harder to manage. And then we also have natural enemies. The more we integrate native plants into and pollinator habitat, beneficial insect habitat into our farms and gardens, we're able to bring in these natural enemies and insects that help to predate our crop pests. So tomato hornworm is parasitized by braconid wasps. And so if you ever see this out in the field, what you see on the right, all of these little white cocoons, that is actually larvae for a wasp that then will kill the tomato hornworm. And you'll want to leave that in the field because that will increase the number of wasps that are out there and help to take care of your pest issues in an ecological way. And a way that we can help support bringing in beneficial insects is through native and targeted plantings. So just a quick example from Marion County's demo garden that I've showed before. 3 years ago, I believe, these were planted, and you can see how small these native plants were when they were established. And then 2 years later, I believe this photo was taken. So the amount of growth that you can get in a relatively short amount of time, and the amount of insects that you can bring in a relatively small space is just incredible. And all of these white flowers, umbelliferous flowers, really help to support those wasps that, again, parasitize or are predators on a lot of our crop insects. And an example of, I guess, this kind of going hand in hand with crop production is that we can support both our pollinators, our beneficial insects, and produce food at the same time if we center that as a goal. And here is a vining milkweed that I left on a kale plant. I did cut it back when it was strangling out the plant a little bit too much, but wanted to also provide food for this monarch caterpillar and not take it away. So I think that's one of the opportunities on a small scale that we have, is we have that ability to really kind of hone in and center on, individual rows, individual beds, and think about how these soil health systems, work, and also support other insects, other life in our gardens. I will wrap up here in just a second on tools and equipment that we can use. There's a lot of different ways to do bread prep. I'm sure you're using many different tools yourself. These are common tools that we see on a small scale or urban environment to do bed preparation, either from using stirrup hose. Broad forks really help to aerate soil and yet not disturb it as much as it would if you were to till those beds. And then to seed or transplant, it can be a challenge into cover crop residue. So contact me, ask me if you have questions about how to really get in there with your cover crop, and how to plant your next crop, because it really depends on your scale, depends on your tools, depends on what you're planting. So I don't know if that's very helpful, but here's a lot of the tools that can be helpful in a small scale environment. So yeah, I'm working with a new program, the Urban Soil Health Program, to improve soil health on urban and community small scale agricultural land. So please get in touch with me if you have more questions. I hope this was a little bit helpful and provided some visuals on what integrating practices can look like, soil health practices and strategies on your gardens. But I know I said it depends a little bit too much, and that's because it is very variable what you're growing and where you're growing it, what strategies you use. So hopefully we'll continue to create even more resources, more programs to be in touch with you. And please contact me if you have questions on your own individual gardens, and we'll work together to help you where you're at.